Is there a difference between your inner child and your inner teenager? Well, imagine this. You're walking through a park on a beautiful sunny day and you stumble across a crying 4-year-old and a crying 14-year-old sat on either side of a wooden bench. How would you comfort them? It's a simple question, and obviously most people would understand that they both require someone to listen to them and they could probably both do with a good hug, but you would not talk to them in anywhere near the same way. If you tried to speak to the teenager as if they were a toddler, you're going to alienate and fundamentally isolate that teenage boy or girl. And if you try to rationalize and psychoanalyze and problem solve with a crying 4-year-old, then they're going to be confused and probably quite emotionally upset. Childhood isn't a single thing, so please stop approaching your inner child work as if you have just one inner child. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the concept of inner child work from age 0 to age 18. I'm going to be introducing 8 psychological books for you to read. Here they are right up front. I'm going to give you a breakdown in just a moment or two, but we're going to work through the entire trauma timeline, the entire inner child timeline, based on your inner toddler, your inner child, and your inner teenager, marking out the milestones and developmental transitional threshold crossings and nuances between the ages to try and give you a full spectrum self-healing inner child toolkit based on the reading and based on some very foundational and very important philosophical guiding principles, which I want you to take from this video. It's going to be a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. Going to try and keep it as short as possible, and let's start with the books for you to read. Maybe you already paused the screen to see the whole stack, but these are 2 books I need you to read no matter what. Healing the Child Within by Charles Whitfield and Homecoming by John Bradshaw. These are without a doubt the best inner child books overall, full spectrum inner child books that you've ever found, and they're both from the 1980s. I've mentioned these on the channel at length. I'm not going to go into any of these books in detail. Just take my word for it, buy these 2 books and put them in the library, because they are going to be a goldmine of information for you, practically speaking. You also have deeper psychological takes, such as Alice Miller's revolutionary work on the drama of the gifted child, and also more practical books about things like the legacy of a painful childhood. You can read both of these books if you want. I'm moving over them very rapidly. You've got in utero experiences and early life pre-memory experiences and windows to the womb, and also this dreadful early 2000s word clip art with the dark side of the inner child. This is not very well written, but it's an interesting title, and we're doing YouTube, so we've got to keep it entertaining. The idea of having a shadow side of the inner child is something which is very valuable. And finally, you're also going to need to understand how to actually parent a child or an inner child part, so you can read some healthy parenting books like this one, or also The Soul of Discipline, which focuses on raising children from toddlers to teens. Here are all the books. You saw them in the stack. Let's get on with the video. Read those in your own time, buy the books. I'm trying to give you a massive shortcut here. Please pay attention. Please buy the books. Most people won't. Nonetheless, let's continue with the video. How can you heal your inner child? Practically and deeply. Fundamentally, you need to understand that there is not such a thing as a single inner child. And I thought about framing this video as a inner toddler, inner child, inner teenager kind of conversation, going through stage by stage and how to work with each age of each child. But then I realized something critical. Everyone that I've ever spoken to about inner child work, when you ask them the question, why do you want to do inner child work? They'll give you an answer like, well, I want to reconnect with my inner child because I know there's more playfulness there, or that I've heard something about potential, or I had a difficult childhood and I know that I need to heal some of those old wounds. There's a variety of answers, but they fundamentally land one stage further than the true answer, which is that they feel bad in the present moment. There's some kind of symptom, there's some kind of sickness, there's some kind of difficult emotion that keeps coming up on a day-to-day basis, and when you actually peel back the desire to do inner child work, it's usually because they're anxious, they're depressed, or they're angry and frustrated at some part in their life, maybe the present day, maybe the future, maybe the past. Those are the 3 main emotions of most healing crises, and you'd be going away from the central issue if you're focusing on inner child work, which is really just one modality in a holistic therapeutic toolkit. So let's bring it back to the absolute center. I'm going to present for you how to do inner child work based on working with anxiety, depression, and anger, or working with fear, sadness, and frustration from a toddler, child, and teen perspective. It's going to be somewhat of a shortened video. I'm not going to give you all the answers, but I think that's the way to make it work, because there's a significant difference in the way that a toddler, a child, and a teenager deal with each of these three core emotions. And if you're working retroactively with your past selves, with your inner children from age 0 to age 18, you're primarily going to be tracing back an emotion that you're feeling in the present day to a potential remnant of a previous encounter, or maybe an overall childhood dynamic that matches the everyday feelings. A very complex way of saying it. I am, again, trying to summarize an entire stack of psychological literature for a digestible free YouTube video. It's something which is a wonderful opportunity, but honestly, inside my new course, the Shadow Work Library, all of Module 5 is on inner child work, and I also have an entire 2-module stack on parts work and archetypal theory and the shadow overall. Please check out the Shadow Work playlist in the description to decide if this is the right fit for you. It's where real depth can come through. I can't do much in just a 15-minute YouTube video. For the sake of working with anger, let's start with anger as one emotion. What's happening for the inner toddler, age 3, age 4, kind of memory, threshold of memory, kind of the best place for most people to work. Any earlier than age 3, you might encounter a lack of experiential memory to actually work with. You've got the inner child at the age of 8 and 9, we'll call that the child, and we've got the inner adolescent at the age of 13 to 15, but again, they can be much older. Framed out the conversation, let's work with anger. Anger for a toddler. It's tantrums, it's sudden bursts of very intense emotion. They are feeling the frustration, they didn't get what they want. You can expect crying, kicking, screaming, biting, shouting, name-calling. It's all very immediate. Toddlers are very good at expressing their emotions with immediacy and with a real honesty because they've yet to be fully repressed. Whereas if you go to the inner child, especially by the age of 8 or 9, they've got enough of an ego and enough of a socially conditioned ego in particular, that they start to repress. We start to bite down on the emotions, and especially if you're a man, there was a certain moment when you were a boy and you heard big boys don't cry, and your honest emotions were likely repressed pretty heavily. It happens roughly about the age 5, age 6. It's a cultural phenomena, and again, I know that women are also engaging in videos like this, but for men in particular, that's a very particular wound. You start hearing it in elementary school, age 5 to age 6. Big boys don't cry, crying's for girls. There's a breaking point there, and that's the beginning of a deep emotional repression. Just a little side note there of what starts to happen in kind of middle childhood period. Emotions get contained. Still, again, children aren't at full emotional maturity. A 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, their anger is going to be informed by social conditioning, but they're still going to be pretty frustrated. They're going to be visibly frustrated. Where it gets interesting is when you go to the teenager. As you remember, when you were a teenager, and it's often again something that we overlook, one of the reasons that we don't talk about the inner teenager in inner child work is that most of us were overlooked as teenagers, and that teenage period was a period of detachment or dissociation or anxiety or existential disconnection or whatever it might have been. You just waited it out until you could get to adulthood. For a few people watching this video, maybe you had a particularly happy set of teenage years. I can't imagine that you'd be watching a video like this if you did truly have a fulfilled, normal, happy, healthy, radiant adolescence. It's typically the case that childhood trauma then continues throughout adolescence. Maybe you're a rare example, not to get on anyone's case, but usually things get worse during our teenage years, not better. And one of the ways it does get worse is with anger, because now anger is no longer something which is expressed outwardly. It's something which is really clamped down on, and it becomes this cold, festering, resentful, bitter, edgy, sarcastic, teenage energy. And there's nothing explicitly dreadful about that. It's not something which you need to drop entirely. It's just being aware of the difference. And the whole spectrum here, and this applies to the other emotions as well. It's the reason I'm starting with anger is it's the most expressive and obvious. Toddler is very open and very external. The child is somewhere between internalization and externalization, and the teenager is often quite internalized, quite heavily internalized. You're very up in your mind when you're a 14-year-old and you're worried about what people think of you. And if you're angry at your parents or angry about something that happened at school or angry about something that you see going on in the world, maybe you're politically inclined, but generally like family and friends and potential romantic interests, that all goes inwards. And then there's these occasional bursts or spikes of anger going outwards. You'll see teenagers who throw a fit, or they try and run away, or they start swearing at their parents. They'll act out, but it's not the same acting out as an 8-year-old, and definitely not the same acting out as a 4-year-old, because they're primarily acting in, which is why substance abuse becomes a thing. The cold frustration towards the parents, as one example, becomes the drinking or the smoking and the I'll show them, they can't control me, I'm going to do what I want in my body, and there's this tinge of excitement and freedom and liberation. It's a classic adolescent rebellion pattern. How do you work with these different ages of yourself in inner child work and parts work? If you understand the basic principles of parts work, which is that you're meeting various shadow subpersonalities and isolated or dissociated psychic fragments of your own internal psychic structure, which is something that I've explained in many videos before, and again, it's something which I've explored at detail inside my shadow work library. Please go join me in the link in the description if you want over 5 hours of free material promoting the shadow work library that goes way deeper on things like inner child work and working with very intense emotions. For the sake of summarizing parts work, if you've already got the foundations of journaling and talking and all of that in place, just about understanding the age-appropriate response and then counterbalancing that with an everyday reality shift. Give you a few practical examples. If you're working with an inner toddler, and that's how do we know we're working with an inner toddler? You're in your active imagination, you're in your parts work, you're asking yourself, where is this anger coming from? And you see the image of your inner toddler, your inner 8-year-old, or your inner 14-year-old. That's usually your best bet that that's the age of the inner child. There are some situations where it's multiple ages of child. If you had anger issues as a 4-year-old, you might quite likely have them as a 14-year-old, but nonetheless, you'll get a first impression. You then start working with that particular part for as long as you need to work with that particular part, but the level of anger that comes out and the level of sophistication of that anger will be quite different. For younger anger, for that toddler anger, that feeling of being rejected or abandoned or abused, it's usually straight up cathartic work. It's a lot of tantruming and thoughtless expression in safe environments, doing the cathartic release, doing the shouting, doing the hitting of the bed with the tennis racket, kicking, punching, biting, clawing, all of those earlier movements. With a child, it can be very similar, but often there's more vocalization. It can be, no, I don't want this, get off me, that's mine, go away. Various phrases start to come out. With the inner adolescent, it's all of that and more. And this is where the diagram on Healing the Child Within by Charles Whitfield is so useful, because you have to remember that you're an adult with an inner teenager who also has an inner child and an inner toddler and an inner baby inside of yourself. You're like one of those sets of Russian dolls where everything's stacked within everything else. So the inner teenager also needs inner child and inner toddler work, and this is where your brain starts to expand about the depths of your own unconscious mind, because you realize that all of the wounding across your entire childhood is nested to some degree within your biology. There's something that's happening in your tissues, there's something that's stored psychically and somatically, which is waiting to be completed, released, or expressed. Work with the age-appropriate thread and the emotion, and do it together, but realistically you're going to need to do all of it at some point or another. If you're primarily struggling with identity issues related to showing up at work and being frustrated you have to play a certain role, it's probably a teenage issue related to role-playing and social masks. If you have a frustration that you're, I don't know, at the gym and someone's talking to you all the time and you just want to push them away and it's not really too complex headily, you just want the space, maybe that's a child response. If you have a frustration and an anger about the fact that, I don't know, toddler-based response, I can't even think of one over the top of my head. You get what I'm saying. Work with the particular emotion, find the particular origin, and then find the age-appropriate expression. Let's move on to a different example. If you're working with sadness, childhood sadness, does not look the same for every child. Some children will become more energized, other children will isolate, some children will seek proximity. This is where it gets complex. I'm trying to make a generalized video, but you weren't a generalized child. You were the child that you were. You were a unique child, and now you're a unique adult. So your history is nested within all of these various specifics and all of these various attachment styles and family dynamics. So your sadness might look very different to my sadness. In fact, my sadness is more depressive and isolating and going inwards and lying in bed and not wanting to have contact. Other people have a similar physiological response of collapsing inwards, even as a toddler, collapsing inwards, being very sad, but they still move towards mother or father because they've got a different attachment issue. If you haven't got the attachment to mother or father, you might isolate more, or maybe if there's aggression and violence in the household, you could have an entirely different response. It's very difficult to give specifics. The same principle nonetheless applies, that the sadness of a toddler is often crying and collapsing, but also anger tends to come through as well. But a lot of needing closeness, needing collapsing, especially if you're crying and then you get picked up by your parent, you collapse into their chest like this and you let it out. You surrender and you soften. The crying and the pain of a child, very similar. Same exact issue for the inner teenager. It tends to be internalized, and crying often takes place in private, or there's more of a narrative formation, especially amongst teenage friends. If you can relate to this moment where something bad happened when you were 13, 14, 15, you may not have spoken to your parents immediately, but you probably spoke to your best friend. There's more of a conversational working through. You may not be crying in front of your friend, but you listen to sad music, you're going through the sad feelings. You don't yet know that this is a normal emotion when you're going through a breakup, or you didn't do too well on a test, or your parents ground you, or something's taken away from you. It feels like you're the only person who's ever experienced this because you're yet to be exposed to the wider world and the normality of the various developmental arcs of human beings, because you're still just a child. So the sadness is all the more crushing. It's not just an emotion which is taking over for a moment of heaviness like a toddler or a child. When you're a teenager, you attach these stories and these narratives, and you can also start believing that it is indeed going to be like this forever. A lot of the chronic depression that people are suffering from in a day-to-day basis does relate back to depression which started when they were a teenager. There are some situations where something bad happened in adulthood, but usually there are some pretty particular patterns of how the teenage boy or girl was handling their sadness that you then get to explore in your own time. You can work through those very heavy emotions, those shut down and isolated, sad, cold feelings, and make the connection from the present to the past. And with conversation with your inner teenager, you can start to move through some of that. And again, another example being anxiety. You know what anxiety is like. It's more of a charge, it's more of a fear, it's more of a scanning response, it's focused on the future. If depression is too much time spent worrying about the past, anxiety is more time than necessary spent anxiously anticipating the future. The toddler doesn't tend to experience too much anxiety about the future. They tend to have more of an immediate fear response. So the toddler will see someone that looks terrifying, maybe a big beard on a stranger feels scary, or maybe a mean face of one of the parents, and they get scared and they get shocked. More immediate, more short term. A child has more of an imaginal capacity to imagine the future. They might imagine they're going into the next grade of school, or moving home, or a dog passing away, or something like this. It's anticipated. Maybe a parent's ill, or grandparent's ill. They have more of an ability to imagine what's going to happen. And then the teenager is an extension of that imaginal capacity to project into the future in a very anxious way. And depending upon your present day symptoms of catastrophizing into the future, or feeling paranoid and anxious in the present, you likewise can trace that back to the immediate inner child that you work with. The same principle applies for each of the emotions. The inner teenager is more psychologically sophisticated than the inner child. The inner child more so than the inner toddler. The inner toddler has more immediate outwards expression, and moving towards the teenager where it gets more internalized and it becomes narratives wrapped around the various children inside of you. Parenting changes based on their age, and one of the books I held up to you earlier, which I moved over quite rapidly, is a fantastic insight into how to raise children across the different ages. It was The Soul of Discipline. This is a wonderful blend between motherly and fatherly principles of how to raise from toddler to teenager. Great archetypal examples of what you need to parent, and if you don't know how to parent, because you're like me and you haven't yet got your own children, you might want to read a few parenting books to know what it means to be empathically supporting a young person. Because if you didn't receive enough of that when you were growing up, if your mom wasn't around or your dad wasn't around or they were around but not very loving, you get to teach yourself how to be a parent for the first time. To make all of this work, the entire reparenting pathway, you need to tap into healthy mother and healthy father energy. Not just one or the other, not just unconditional love and compassion and the idealized divine feminine, and not just order and structure and provision and safety and material resources of the idealized father. Many, 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 many more complexities to that story. Generalizing and simplifying, neither but both. Motherly and fatherly principles, and in an ideal relationship, both of the parents will have the right blend between the two of them. Sometimes it's the mother having more of the father energy, usually speaking. Women have more of the motherly energy. Men have more of the fatherly energy. It's a very classic stereotype, but it's generally true across cultures. You need to develop some of that inside of yourself. For me personally, I had to develop more of the mothering energy. If you're a woman watching this, develop more of the fathering energy, which means creating the structure. I had to develop more of the compassion. You get where I'm going with that. You can't avoid the love. You can't bypass the lacking skill of knowing how to love a child. And if you're in an unfortunate situation where you weren't given the kind of love that you needed when the sadness, the frustration, or the anxiety was hitting your little heart as you were a child, it's your task and responsibility to gather the resources, maybe some of the resources which I've held up in this video, which you can go back and screenshot and put into your favorite secondhand bookseller, and start to heal yourself, because this year can be the final year where you suffer from these problems. You can really make this truly be the last year where you're wrapped up in old anxiety, depression, and fear and anger responses. You just don't need to carry this forever. Inner child work is merely one approach to psychic self-healing. It doesn't need to be pedestalized. It's a tool that you can use. It's a way of exploring your own active imagination, which can be fully fascinating and fully healing until the point where it's more or less complete, and then you can move on with your life. You can be informed by your inner children, but also, let's be real, you're an adult living here today, and you've got the future ahead of you, and the past, once it's healed, if it was a dark past, doesn't need to consume all of your attention and focus. You really can heal. I'll leave it there. Leave a comment in the comment section if you want a more specific video on a certain type of inner child, and I'll do my best to make that. And in the meantime, go check out the link in the description for my shadow work library, the promotional course, and also the course itself. It is the best work I've ever produced, and it takes all of this material to true depth based on a 36-book curriculum, which took me 4 years to research, rather than a 20-minute entertaining YouTube video. You'll get a lot more depth from joining me in deep space, or you can stay on YouTube and join me over here. But I recommend you go to the description.